Correct. All right, Jabosai, good evening, good evening, good evening, a good Erev Shabbos. This is so special and so sweet and so beautiful, Baruch Hashem, to be able to do this together. Maybe we should, all right, we'll think about what we'll do in the future, Amir Hashem, but it is so special, Baruch Hashem, to be here with all of you together. All right, we have enough of that. We got a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, let us begin. Sorry. Okay. Let's begin. I think I'm good without the mic. No, you hear me all right? All right. Let's say today's daf is Lamed Gimel. Today's daf is Lamed Gimel. I should say Friday's daf. Sorry, Friday's daf is Lamed Gimel. So we are Emirat Hashem going to continue today. We are picking up today on Lamed Beis Amud Aleph, 32a. So we left off. Elazar ben Masya. So the Gemara says as follows: 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines up from the bottom. Elazar ben Masya Omer, Abba Omer Shkini Mayim, Umitzvah Lasos. So we'll say what happens. So remember, we're talking over here about what happens in situations of conflict. Namely, there's a conflict between the mitzvah of Kibbud Av Va'im and a conflict ultimately again between some other mitzvah. So in this case over here, my father is telling me, go ahead and give me something to drink. And there's another mitzvah that I'm obligated to perform. So which one takes precedence? So the Gemara says, Maniach ani es kavod abba va'oseh mitzvah. So ultimately, Allah says, I'm going to leave aside the kibbud av and I'm going to do the mitzvah. Why? Shani va'abba chayav b'mitzvah. Because my father and I are both chayiv to go ahead and serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in other words, we'll say, what Allah is saying is like this: when there's a conflict between the obligation I have to my father versus ultimately again an obligation that I have towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'm going to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why? Because both my father and I are required or obligated to serve the Ribono Shel Olam. Isi ben Yehuda or Isi ben Yehuda says, Im efshel mitzvah yasas ayidei acherim. Isi ben Yehuda says, if the mitzvah itself could be performed through others, in other words, the other mitzvah, so then te'aseh ayidei acherim v'yelechu b'chavod aviv. So I will say, if the mitzvah, whatever the other mitzvah is, if it could be done by someone else, then let someone else do the mitzvah, and you perform the mitzvah of kibbud av va'im. Rav Masna said, halacha ki isi ben Yehuda. The halacha follows isi ben Yehuda. So that is indeed what the Shulchan Aruch codifies. So if a person has two mitzvahs in front of him, one we'll call it a mitzvah of ben adam lamakom, the other or even a ben adam lachavero, the other kibbud av va'im. So if possible, if the person could outsource the performance of the other mitzvah to someone else and thereby free themselves up to go ahead and perform the mitzvah of kibbud av va'im, that is preferable. That is preferable. Incredible. I'm Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Shila, I'm Rabbi Masna, I'm Rabbi Chisda. Ha'af shemacha al kvodo kvodo mochel. Both say a father who is mochel on his kavod, right? A father who forgives his kavod is forgiven. His kavod is forgiven. So ha'rav shemacha al kvodo ein kvodo mochel. But if a rav is mochel on his kavod, ultimately again his kavod is not forgiven. So Rav Yosef says, "Afilu harav shamacha al kavodo kavodo machol." Not true. Even right? Even ultimately, again, if this is Daf Yomi after 5 p.m. edition, right? This is it's 5 o'clock somewhere, right? So you know what's great about this? That nobody flinches. That's what I love about it. Yeah, I know. It did take years. So again, the Gemara says like this. So if a father is mochel on his kavod, so the kavod is mochel, right? A rebbe or a rav is mochel on his kavod. The kavod is not mochel. Kavod is not mochel. Even if a rav is mochel on his kavod, ultimately, again, the kavod is machal. It's forgiven. Shneimar, v'Hashem holech lifnehem yomam. I will say it's fascinating. Why? Because in the desert, the Ribono Shel Olam himself cared for the needs of Klal Yisrael. So that was the Ribono Shel Olam, so to speak, being mochel on his kavod. He was forgiving his kavod because he was taking care of activities of daily living for others. So the Gemara says, "Amar v'hachi ashta asam HaKadosh Baruch Hu alma dilehu v'tari dilehu machal elikare." The Ribono Shel Olam, everything belongs to Hashem. So because everything belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right, the Torah is His, therefore the kavod is His, and therefore by extension He has the ability to go ahead and forgive that kavod, forgive that honor. On the other hand, Rabbi say, Amud Beis, good. Hacha, Torah dilehu. Rabbi say, but how could a Rav be mochel on his kavod? After all, remember, the kavod of a Rav, or the kavod of a Rebbe, it's not his own kavod. What is the kavod? It's the kavod of Torah. But the Torah is not his. Torah belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So how can you, in general, you can only be mochel on something that is yours. If something is not yours, you can't be mochel. So if the kavod of a Talmid Chacham, the kavod of a Rav, the kavod of a Rebbe, it's not his, it's Torah. So how does he have the right to be mochel on it? Amar Rabba, in Torah Leibos is beautiful line. No, Torah is his. Where do we say it from? Dichsiv ubesoraso yehageh yomam valayla. Rabbi said this is beautiful. What does the pasuk say? In his Torah shall he toil day and night. So Rabbi say, what do you see from this? When a person learns Torah, this is so beautiful. When a person learns Torah, the Torah it just makes it look more awkward. The person ultimately, again, when a person learns Torah, the Torah becomes his. It's incredible. When you learn, before you learn, the Torah belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Once you go ahead and you learn, that Torah ultimately becomes yours. Once it becomes yours, then halacha l'maisa, you have the right, you have the ability ultimately to forgive it. Ini, is that so? Is that so, Abosai? So the Gemara says, V'ha Rava mashki behi lula dibrei. Listen to this. Rava was at the chasana of his son. It's actually a beautiful Gemara. And what was Rava doing at the chasana of his son? He was pouring drinks. Mamish and Yonei Diyoma, right? He was pouring drinks. So obviously, again, for Rava to tend bar, so to speak, for Rava to pour drinks would definitely be beneath his kavod. So the Gemara says, "V'dale the kasla rapapa, all the Rafuna, braid Rav Yoshua, the kamu mikamei," and ultimately, again, he poured a cup of wine for Rapapa, Rafuna Yoshua, and they stood up before Rava. Mikamei le Rav Mari or Rav Pinchas braid Rav Chista. Then he poured a cup for Rav Mari and Rav Pinchas braid Rava. V'lo kamu mikamei. They did not stand up for Rava. And what happened? Rabbi said, "Ikbid." Rava was offended. Rabbi say it's always so. Rava was offended because he felt that these other Rabbanim were not displaying to him proper. Rabbi say Lamed Beis and Beis 32b. We are now 7 lines down from the top. So Rabbi say so. Rava was offended because he wasn't given covenant. Rabbi say so. What do you see from here? You see from here that even if a Rav is mochel on his kavod, see here Rav is pouring wine, which indicates that what? Why was Rav is mochel? Right? He's mochel. Otherwise, he wouldn't be pouring wine for everyone. But even if a Rav is mochel on his kavod is not forgiven. That's why when these other Rabbanim didn't stand up in front of him, he was offended. Now, I just want to point out, the fact that he was offended, it's not like an ego thing. The fact that he was offended is that Rav understood that he represented Kavod HaTorah, and a lack of respect for Rav was a lack of respect for Torah, and a lack of respect for Torah is a lack of respect for the Ribono Shel Olam. So in that respect, that's why Rav got upset. Another story: V'amra Hano Rabbanon. Rabbanon, Vano, Rabbanon, Lav Rabbanon. These first set of rabbis, they're real rabbis. The second set of rabbis, they're not rabbis. You're like, I say that all the time, right? And the Gemara says, "V'su Rav Papa hava mashki behilula da Abba Marbere." So we'll say similarly again. Rav Papa was once pouring wine for his guests at the chasana of his son of Abba Mar. V'dali le'kasar Rabbi Yitzchak berei Rav Yehuda. He poured a glass of wine for Rabbi Yitzchak. V'lo kami kamei. Rabbi Yitzchak didn't stand up. V'ikbid, and ultimately again Rav Papa got offended. Once again, Abba say, so what you begin to see is the fact that these Rabbanim are pouring wine indicates that they're mochel on their kavod. But yet, when they get offended that other people don't respect them, that shows that the halacha is that even if a Rebbe is mochel on his kavod, the kavod is not mochel, the kavod is not forgiven, you still have to respect. So the Gemara says, good. So veikbid afilu hachi hidor mi'avet lebaz. The Gemara says, well, maybe even if a Rebbe is machal on his kavod, maybe the kavod is machal. But I will say maybe even if the kavod is machal, maybe still, nevertheless, others still have to go ahead and display some level of kavod. I will say what the Gemara calls hidor. So I will say, give an example. Let's say the kavod I should have for a Rav, kavod I should have for my Rebbe is when he walks in the room, I stand up. So let's say for argument's sake, a Rebbe is mochel on his kavod, right? And let's say we say that Rav Shemachal Kvoda Kvoda Machal. Let's say when a Rebbe is mochel on his kavod, really the kavod is forgiven. Even though it's forgiven, the Talmud or anyone else still has an obligation to display some level of respect. So we'll say, you ever see like sometimes even when a person's not getting up, they move, right? So in other words, moving yourself, just the movement. So again, that's not a full standing up. But it's what the Gemara calls hiddur, right? It's a smaller display of honor. So the Gemara goes weiter. Even according to the opinion that says that when a Rebbe is mochel on his kavod, ultimately the kavod is forgiven. Nasi shemachal kvoda in kvoda machal. If a nasi is mochel on his kavod, right? So remember again, nasi is also the head of the Jewish people. So ultimately, again, his kavod is not machal. Meisvei, is that true? Ma'aser Rabbi Eliezer Yoshua Rabbi Tzadok she'mesubim beis Hamishna. There was once a story. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Tzadok were sitting at a wedding feast I was going to say in Bnei Brak, right? But no, but Beis HaMishta, and it doesn't say where. So the Beis HaMishta Beno Shel Rabbi Gamliel. So they were at the Chasen of Rabbi Gamliel's son. Rabbi Gamliel was pouring wine for everyone. So what happens? Nasan Akos Rabbi Eliezer, v'lo natlo. Rabbi Gamliel handed a glass of wine to Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Eliezer would not accept it. He wouldn't accept it. He felt that it would have been a lack of kavod to accept a glass of wine from Rabbi Gamliel. Thank you, Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel gave the glass of wine to Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Yoshua accepted it. Amrlo, Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, Maza Yoshua. So Rabbi Eliezer gave Rabbi Yoshua, right, Musar. Yoshua, what's the matter with you? Right, what Maza Yoshua? Anu Yoshvim, Rabbi Gamliel, Omedu Mashkalenu. We're going to sit here and allow Rabbi Gamliel to serve us. Amrle, so Rabbi says, incredible. Rabbi Yoshua responds, Matzinu Gadol man of Sheshimesh. We find someone even greater than Rabbi Gamliel who served his guests. Who was that? Avram Gadol Hadar Haya. Avram Avinu was the Gadol Hadar, the Kasuv Bava who Omeid Alehem. And Rabbi say, remember again when the guests came, Parshas Vayera, when the guests show up to Avram Avinu's tent, what does he do? He serves them. Rabbi say, not only does he serve them, but while they're sitting, he stands over them. So if Avram Avinu could go ahead and take care of his guests, Rabbi Gamliel could certainly do it. Maybe you'll say, well, no, it was different. Avram knew they were malachim. Maybe you'll say, Avram knew they were malachim. No. He says, Lo nidmu lo elal Aravim. They look like Arabs. In other words, they look like regular Semitic people. In other words, they did not look like malachim. So if Avram could serve his guests, why can't Rabbi Gamliel serve his guests? Incredible. Amar lahem Rabbi Tzadok. Rabbi Tzadok says incredible. He says, I must say atem manichim kvodo shamakom. It's so beautiful. You could imagine this scene, right? They're sitting at the wedding. This is probably after the chuppah during pictures, right? While everyone is sitting around watching hours fly by, right? So again, they're sitting, and I'll say it's incredible. Rabbi Gamliel serving wine, and they're like debating this, right? They're debating about. So Rabbi Tzadok says, I don't understand. What's the matter with you guys? He says, why are you bringing a raya from Avram Avinu, from a person? As great as Avram was, he was a person. Bring a raya from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu meishiv ruchos, umala nesim, umorid matar, umatzmiach adama, va'orich shulchan lifnei kol echad ve'echad. They will say, you know what the Ribono Shel Olam does for us? You know what he does for us? Everything. Everything. I will say, what a Gemara to learn on Erev Rosh Hashanah. What does the Ribono Shel Olam do for us? Everything he does for us. Literally translated. He goes and he brings the rain. He moves the clouds. He causes things to sprout. He sets a tail before everyone. So if HaKadosh Baruch Hu could serve us, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu could serve us, Rabbi Gamliel could serve us as well. Obviously, we wouldn't make him serve us, but if he wants to serve us, we absolutely have the right to accept that service. Rather, we have to amend the halacha as follows. This is halacha l'maisa. Even the opinion that says that a nasi who is mochel on his kavod, right? That if a nasi forgives his kavod, ultimately again the kavod is mochel. Melech shemachal al kavodo ein kavodo mochel. If a king tries to forgive his honor, ultimately again the honor is not forgiven. Shnei amar som tasim alecha melech. Place upon yourselves a king, shete emaso alecha, that ultimately, again, the fear and reverence of the king should be upon you. Shabbos says, here's how he paskin. A father is permitted to be mochel on his kavod. A rebbe is permitted to be mochel on his kavod. A nasi is permitted to be mochel on his kavod. A melech, a king, may not be mochel on his kavod. That is the one area. Now, I will say there is also a difference in the world of Rebbeim. There's also a Rebbe Mufhak. We're going to talk about this a little bit more. Rebbe Mufhak, a regular Rebbe. But halacha ma'aseh, for our purposes, everyone except the Melech has the ability. This is very important. Why? We're going to get into. We already started to discuss the halachas of kibbud avim and mora. Right. So one of the ways in which the Gemara says you're supposed to go ahead and be mechabed your father, your parents, is you stand up when they walk in the room. But let's say it's very common that children don't stand up for their parents when they walk in the room. So what's the pshat? So the Aruch HaShulchan has a fascinating. The Aruch HaShulchan says essentially contemporarily, and already he's in the 1800s, contemporarily, there is an implied mechila by parents. That parents are mochel. Parents are mochel, again, on this specific, not on their kavod in general, right? But parents are mochel on the concept of standing up, which is why it says the Aruch HaShulchan, you'll find many dedicated, loving, and attentive children who don't stand up for their parents when they walk into the room. Interesting idea. So Gemara says as follows: Tan Rabbanon, mipnei seva takum. So the pasuk says again, you shall get up in front of an old person. Yachol afilu mipnei zaken hashmai. You might have thought even before an old person who's ignorant and evil. Tamalomar zaken vein zaken elachachar. Also remember again, zaken itself is an acronym for zeh shekana chachma. It's talking about a Talmud Chacham. Shneimar asvali shivim ish miziknei Yisrael. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer ein zaken elamisha kana chachma. Here it is. We'll say, what's a zaken? Zaken doesn't just simply refer to biological age, but zaken refers to someone who has acquired wisdom. Someone who's acquired. Good. It was Daf first. But come, we could do. I could take a little harmony for Daf Yomi. I could. Hey. So the Gemara says as follows. Shneimar Hashem Kanani Reishes Darko Yachol Yamod Mipanav Mimakom Rachok. So you might have thought maybe you should stand up for an older person, even right as zaken, even from far away. Tamalomar Takum Vahadarta. Pasuk says you shall stand up, and it should be a beautiful standing up. Lo Amarti Kima Elubamakom Sheish Hider. We'll say the only time you're obligated to go ahead and stand up for a zaken is when there's hider, when there's beauty in it. We'll say, when is there beauty in it? When it's clear that the act of standing is for the zaken. If the zaken is too far away, then the act of standing doesn't correlate, doesn't connect with a particular zaken. Therefore, there's no covered. You might have thought maybe again the obligation to honor a zaken is even done financially. Just like ultimately standing up doesn't cost you any money, so to the way in which you're obligated to honor someone who is old, a zaken, is through non-financial means. But you're not obligated to. I'm sorry. Oh, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So the Gemara says, We'll say, I'm going to thought, what if I'm in the bathroom or in the bathhouse and a zaken walks by? Maybe I should stand up over there just like that. So the Gemara says, no. Talmud Lomar talking takum bahadarta. Lamarti kimo el b'makom sheyesh hider. The standing up, obviously, I will say, has to be something that's demonstrative of respect. But Lamai says, standing up, that's going to be a little bit less than respectful. Ultimately, again, one should not do. Yachol yatzim einav k'mishaloro. You might have thought that maybe, again, if you see an old person approaching, a zaken approaching, you should close your eyes, pretend like you don't see him, in order to avoid standing up for him. Talmud Lomar talking v'yaresa. Talking davar masra lelev. This entire mitzvah, I will say, is given over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You might be able to fool people by closing your eyes, pretending you don't see them, but you cannot fool HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ne'emar bo v'yersim elakecha. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, minayin lezaken shalei atriach. This is incredible. How do you know that a zaken, I will say, shouldn't be matriach? In other words, that if a zaken could find a way to walk around without causing people to have to stand up, that's ideal. I will say it's incredible. In other words, sometimes in life you could be people may be obligated to give you kavod, but there's also kinds just because people are obligated to give you kavod doesn't mean that what you should exercise that right. There's something to be said for not causing just not putting people in a position of an inconvenient position. So sometimes a person who you have to stand up for walks in, okay, so I have to stand up. It could be a shtickle inconvenient. So how do I know that even if I'm the person who other people are obligated to be mechabed, I should try to avoid triggering those kibbutz situations so as not to inconvenience them? Talmud Omar, zaken v'yaresa. Isi ben Yehuda Omer, Isi ben Yehuda says, Mipnei seva takum, afilu kol seva mashma. So Isi ben Yehuda says, the truth is, Mipnei seva takum abosai applies to every single old person. Whenever you encounter an old person, there's an obligation to honor them and an obligation to stand up for them. So Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi Aglili Hainu Tanakam. Rabbi Yossi is saying the same thing as the Tanakama. Ika benayo yonik v'chacham. We'll say, watch this. Here's the interesting nafkamina. What happens if you have a person who is biologically young but very wise? Is there an obligation to stand up for such a person? Tanakama savar yonik v'chacham lo. Tanakama holds no. Mipnei seva takum ba'adarta pnei zakin means you're only obligated to honor someone who's old, but someone who is young, no matter how wise he may be, there's not a mitzvah of kibbut. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says no, even if he's young and wise. In other words, we'll say, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the concept of seva or zakin for that matter, means wisdom. It's not really as much about biological. It's just often in life, advanced biological age and life wisdom tend to go hand in hand. But if you have someone who's young but exceptionally wise, one should be mechabe that person. So that's machlokes Rabbi Yossi and the Tanakama. Says on my time, Rabbi Yossi logic. So if ultimately again you're correct, like the Tanakama said, Im kein nichtov rachmanim b'pnei seva zaken takum va'adarta. Why not put seva and zaken together? If the obligation for kibbut is only on someone who's actually elderly, however we're defining elderly, Why not put Seva and Zakin together? Why does the Torah split Seva from Zakin? The high love high, the high love high. To teach us that there are two different categories, both sides. Zakin is someone old. Or Seva is someone old. And Zakin is someone wise, even if they're young. You're obligated to give cover to both of them. Shmamina, hafilu yonach v'chachim. V'tanakam mishun debai lemismach Zakin v'yaresa. Tanakama says, no. The reason why the pasuk is structured that way is because you have to juxtapose Zakin and Yaresa for the drasha we had before. The Tanakama, my taima. What's Tanakama's logic that you don't have to give covet to a young wise person? Today's daf, right? Mipnei seva takum v'hadarta. Right? Mipnei seva takum v'hadarta. Takum v'adarta p'nei zakin. Umedolo kosev hachi. Since the pasuk wasn't written that way, we'll say 33a, second line down. Shmamina chadhu. See ultimately again that they're really one and the same. That seva and zakin are the same person. Seva and zakin refer to an elderly person who is wise. Or I will say, really what the Gemara is saying is like this. It is assumed that an elderly person is wise. That's the default assumption. Obviously, if you have an elderly person who you know is a Rasha, then you're not obligated to stand up for that person. But an elderly person, by definition, because of their life experience, is automatically considered to be wise, and therefore, Allah Lamaisa, there is an obligation for kibbud. So Gemara says, listen to this. It's actually fascinating. So how do we paskin, by the way? So this is actually an interesting machlokas. So everyone will agree that if you have an elderly person, right, again, whether they're Talmud Chacham or not is irrelevant. You're obligated to give kavod to an elderly person. Why? Because at the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, they're considered zeshek kana chachma, right? What about a young wise person? Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch both paskin. One is obligated to give kavod to such an individual like that. That there is a din of kibbud. We pass like Rabbi Yosef Lili. That ultimately again there's seva and there's zaken. Two different people. Seva is an old person who is wise. Zaken zeshek kana chacham is even a young person who is wise. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Amar Mar, you might have thought that maybe you're obligated to give kavod ultimately again to an older person with money, financial means. So the Gemara says, Talmud takum ba'adarta. Makima she'in b'chisaron kis, just like standing up does not have financial cost. Af hider she'in b'chisaron kis. So Rabbi say in the case of hider of honor is also when there is no loss of money. The kima lesta b'chisaron kis. So I'll say, but one second, standing up doesn't always come without a financial loss. After all, milo askinan de kanakiv marganisa adahachi v'hachi kami kamei ubatim malachto. I'll say, just to give you like a contemporary example of this. Let's say a guy is a jeweler and he deals with fine gems. So I'll say, you know how it is. Like when you're dealing with those fine gems, you get in your zone, right? And you have your particular finger dexterity lined up. If you have to stop and put everything down and then stand up, that's a loss of money. That's a loss of money. That's a potential loss of income. To which the Gemara says, Ella akish kima lehider. We compare standing up to hider, ma hider she'in bo bittul, just like Abba say hider, ultimately there's no bittul, af kima she'in bo bittul. So to again Abba say, this is very important. If the only way that I could honor an elderly person is by standing up in a way that is going to cost me money, right, financial loss, I'm not obligated to do that. The only time there's an obligation to go ahead and honor is when I could do so without a financial loss. Incredible. So the Gemara says, good. Makim shemach chizar kis av hidush shemach chizar kis. Mikan amru ein ba'ali umnios rishayin lamom netamid chachamim b'shah she'oskim malachtam. Both say this is the halach is incredible. Workmen. Yeah, workmen, laborers. Ba'ali umnios, right? Tradesmen, workers, craftsmen. Good. Okay. Good workers, right? Craftsmen. The reason I'm saying it is because what omnios really refers to is sometimes also like a little bit of like a specialized labor, like a skilled labor. So Bali omnios are not obligated to stand up for Talmidei Chachamim during their workday. Well, isn't that fascinating, right? So let's say, for argument's sake, I work for a diamond dealer, right? And I'm in the middle, and Talmid Chacham walks by, I'm not obligated to stand up. Why, Rabbi? Say why? Because if I stand up, what does that represent, or potentially represent? A loss of income. Obviously, if I'm on a lunch break, okay, that's something different. But Lamais, if it represents a loss of income, one is not obligated to do so. Is that true? Velo? Vatnan, Kol Bali Omnius Omdim Mipnehem, Shalom Bishlomeh, Va'ormulahem. But we'll say one second, this is incredible Mishnah by Bikurim. By Bikurim, the halacha is that when they would bring the Bikurim to Yerushalayim, everybody would shut their stores, right? And all the craftsmen, right, would stop working, and they would come, and they would speak to the people bringing the Bikurim, and they would say to them, bro says so beautiful, first wide line, Achinu Anshe Malkum Ploni, who's coming from so-and-so place, because remember, people would bring bikurim from different regions at different times. So everybody would shut down their work and they would go out and greet all the people bringing bikurim. And they give them a shalom aleichem. So both say, see, now again, so you see from here, to greet the bikurim bringers, they would stop working. So if you're stopping to greet the bikurim bringers, then bepashtos, then what? You should stop to go ahead and give cover to a Talmid Chacham. Rabbi Yochanan says, no. It was dafka for the people who brought bikurim, that they would stop their work and stand up. But ultimately, again, for Talmidei Chachamim, they would not. Why Rabbi says is incredible. Rabbi Yossi, Barabin, Bo Urei Kama Chaviva Mitzvah B'Shaita. Both say you can see from here how special a mitzvah is when it is performed at its appointed time. Shar mipneihem omdim, mipnei tamdi chachamim ein omdim. I will say this is the power of a mitzvah. Sometimes a mitzvah has greater power than a Talmid Chacham. Right? So if you're a worker, you cannot go ahead and stand up in the middle of your work to give cover to a Talmid Chacham. But when they bring the bikurim, out of covet for the mitzvah, that you could stop your work. Furthermore, the Gemara says, "Vidol moshani hasam deimkein at machshin lasalavo." We'll say there's actually another interesting idea over here, which is as follows: that there was a concern that if they wouldn't shut the stores to greet the meviei bikurim, we'll say what could happen? You know, you have these guys schlepping from all over Eretz Yisrael to bring their bikurim. So can you imagine? You come to Yerushalayim and what? And no one greets you. We'll say, how is that going to make you feel about your journey? How is it going to make you feel? Like it was a waste. I'm not doing this again. So we'll say, so therefore, maybe in order to ensure future encouragement, ultimately, again, of bikurim, they made everyone shut their stores and go ahead and greet everyone. We'll say, by the way, an exceptional Musar Haskell for us to learn about also Erev Rosh Hashanah. We'll say, especially the chaver that's davening here. And the truth is, I think wherever you daven, anywhere you daven Yom Noraim, there are always new faces. There are always people. I will say, sometimes what makes or breaks an experience for someone is how the indigenous chevra greets them when they come in. You walk into a shul that's maybe not your regular shul, maybe not one that you frequent all the time, and no one gives you the time of day. No one gives you a shalom aleichem. No one offers you a machzor, a siddur, a place. I don't even mean like an invitation for lunch. Forget about that right now. Just a shalom aleichem, just a sever panim yafos, just a hello. Let's say, you'd be surprised a person could say, what do I need this for? This is by bikurim, which is a mitzvah d'oraisa. Kadosh Baruch Hu tells you to bring your bikurim, and yet we're still concerned that if the chevra doesn't get the right greeting in Yerushalayim, what's going to happen? They're not going to come back again. Alachas kama v'kama. Person walks into shul, will say how careful we have to be to make sure to be makabel kol adam b'sever panim yafos. Everyone with a smile, everyone with a shalom aleichem, everyone with a hello. Simar goes weiter. Amar yachol yamam me panim beisakise beisamercha is an interesting one. We'll say, so let's say I would have thought if I'm in the bathroom or I'm in the bathhouse and a zakin walks in, maybe I should stand up and give him kavod. To which the Gemara says, don't do that, right? Velo, the Gemara says, really, I don't do that. Rabbi Chia, listen to this, some stories over here. All right, keep it together. So the Gemara says as follows. What about the following story? Vaha Rabbi Chia, Havi Yosef, whatever talking is going on here on the sidelines, shut it down now, right? Shut it down now, because it's not good. I know it's not going to be good, right? So the Gemara says as follows. Whatever Rashi you're giving to this, leave the Perushim to me. I will tell you all the Perushim you need to know. So the Gemara says as follows. So at one time, Rabbi Chia was sitting in the bathhouse, and who walked by? Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi. Rabbi Chia didn't get up, right? And Rabbi Shimon got upset. He got offended. And he came and he told his father, I taught this guy, Rabbi Shimon says, I taught this guy, Rabbi Chia, 2/5 of Sefer Tehillim, and he doesn't stand up for me in the bathhouse? A chutzpah. Visu, bar kaf Rav Amli Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yossi, Havi Yosef be'masusa. We'll say, so we'll just go with Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel was sitting in the bathhouse. All the others, Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi came in. V'lo kami kamei, and Rabbi Shmuel didn't get up. Ve'ikbid, and ultimately again, Rabbi Shimon got very upset. He was very offended. And he went and he told his father, Shnei shlishi shlish, 1/9 of Torah's Kohanim I taught him for the Amad Mipana. In other words, I taught him significant Torah. And ultimately, again, he doesn't stand up. So what do you see from these stories? That apparently you are obligated to stand up even in the bathhouse. V'amarlo, he responded, Shema bahen yoshev u'maharher. So we'll say this is very interesting. So his father responded to him, well, listen, maybe the reason Rabbi Shmuel didn't get up is because maybe he was engrossed in thought, maybe about the very Torah that you had taught him. the very Torah that you had taught him. So I will say a really interesting and profound idea. I will say, so first of all, there's a tremendous Musar Haskell in this in general, which is, that sometimes what ends up happening in life is somebody does something and we automatically judge them. We judge them. And we're able to go ahead and size up the entirety of what it is that they're doing and why they're doing it. And I will say, what the amazing part is? Sometimes, I don't know or maybe often, we're wrong. Sometimes the intentions that we ascribe to people's actions are in fact fundamentally incorrect. And that is why in life it is so important to avoid judging the other. Because more often than not, you can never get into someone's head. You can never get into someone's heart. And so often we don't know why people do the things that they do. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Time about halav hachi lo. Now we'll say again, but it seems from all of these stories that Lamaisa, there is an obligation to go ahead and stand up, even in the bathhouse. So kasha, lo kasha, to which the Gemara says, lo kasha, ha b'batei gavai, ha b'batei barai. Both say there are two different parts of the bathhouse. Everyone knows this, right? There's the inner chambers of the bathhouse, the outer chambers of the bathhouse. The inner chambers of the bathhouse, you are unclothed. When you are unclothed, don't stand up for anyone, right? That's also a good lesson out of Rosh Hashanah, the mikvah, right? I'm just saying, don't stand up for anyone, right? Do what you have to do, get in and get out, right? That's it. On the outer chamber, I will say, everybody's clothed. In the outer chamber, I guess that was like the chill spot, in Talmudic times also. You go to the outer place of the bathhouse. So Lamaisa again, everyone's clothed there. So that's what we'll say where if Zakin comes in, ultimately again there is an obligation to stand up. So therefore it's not a stira, it depends which part of the bathhouse you find yourself in. Hachanaim, this seems to be clear. The Amar Rabba Bar Rachana Amar Rabbi Yochanan, B'chol mokom mutar lahareb chutz mibeis hamerchatz u'mibeis hakisei. So we'll say, so again we also learn this, that your one is not permitted to go ahead and think about Torah in the Beis HaMerchatz, the bathhouse, or in the bathroom, to which the Gemara says, Dilma la'on se shiny. Maybe the difference over here, we'll say, could very well be, I think this froze. Yeah. Oh, it's internet? Okay. All right, so ultimately, perhaps onse shani, perhaps halacha lemaisa, when there is an ones, when there is some extenuating circumstance, perhaps ultimately again it's different. Yachol yatzim in of kamishal oro. I'll say I'm going to thought that halacha lemaisa. Maybe you could close your eyes and pretend like you don't see the zaken. To which the Gemara says Yachol yatzim in of kamishal oro. Atabrishyaskinan. What are you talking about? Why would you even entertain a possibility that you could pretend like you don't see the zaken and thereby avoid standing up? Are we dealing with Rishaim? Dealing people? To which the Gemara says, Ella, Yachol yatzim ina mikamei dilimte zman chiyuva techimata zman chiyuva halo chazile dikam mikamei. But say no, I would have felt like this. Remember, the obligation to stand up for a zaken is only really when he's in your dalat amas, as we're going to see in just a moment, in your proximity. I might have thought that maybe when he's out of my dalat amas, I am allowed to close my eyes so that I don't see him come into my dalat amas, at which point the obligation for kibud would be triggered. That's the havamina. Tamalomar, taklam v'aresa. Rabbi said the halacha is you can't do that. Tana ezui kima sheish b'ayid. Rabbi said, what does it mean? What type of standing up is a display of respect for a zaken? Heavy omer zed dalat amas. That refers ultimately again to dalat amas. Amar Abaye says, "Lo Amar Ella birabo she'ena mufak." We'll say so again. The only time you're obligated to stand up for a zaken, ultimately again, is when he enters into your dalat amas. Outside of dalat amas, you're not obligated to stand up because we'll say the logic is outside of dalat amas, the act of standing doesn't necessarily immediately correlate. It doesn't geographically correlate with the zaken. This is different than your Rebbe mufak, than your primary Rebbe. Abaravo mufak melo enav. We'll say Rebbe mufak, primary Rebbe. As soon as you see him, as soon as he is in, ocular range. You see him, halach lamais, you have to stand up no matter how far he is. Pretty incredible. So the Gemara goes back to the Gemara says, Abaye, michi hava chazila udnei dechamra Rav Yosef, da'asi hava kaim Abaye. Hava kaim, sorry. We'll say Abaye, from the moment that he would see the ear of the donkey of his Rebbe Rav Yosef. I guess Rav Yosef's donkeys had distinctive ears. So as soon as he saw the ears of his Rebbe's donkey, he would stand up. He would stand up. So Abaye have a rachiv chamra. So Abaye one time was riding on a donkey. The kamaski aguda dinar sagin. He was riding along the banks of the river Sagya. Yosef Ramshashi of Rabbanon beidach gisa. So Ramshashi and other Rabbanim were sitting on the other side of the river. For lo kami kameh, they were able to see Abaye. Abaye was their Rebbe, yet they didn't stand up. Amr Lahu, Abaye says to him, Valav Rabba Mufakana, am I not your Rebbe Mufak? Why are you not standing up? Amrulay lavadaitim. They said, we're so sorry, we were preoccupied with our learning. I will say two incredible lessons here. Once again, same lesson as we saw before. don't assume you understand people's intentions, and don't assume you understand why people do the things that they do, because so often what looks sinister or what looks negative or what looks as a slight is very often nothing more than a simple oversight. Rabbi, so what you also see over here is the obligation of a Rebbe, right? The obligation of a Rebbe, and also by extension the obligation of a parent, which is to point out when something wrong is being done. You know, I say often, we are so concerned about pointing out wrongdoings to our children, to others. We're always afraid of alienating everyone, right? But the truth is, what makes a Rebbe is that he's able to tell you that you're doing something wrong. Just like what makes a parent is that he's able to tell you doing something wrong. What makes a friend is that he's able to tell you you're doing something wrong. And if any relationship, you're too scared to do that, either it's not a real friendship, it's not a real Rebbe, or it's a shirking of parental responsibility. An incredible yisod. The Gemara goes weiter. Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer, how do I know, Rabbi, that as much as there's an obligation to go ahead and stand up for a zaken, the zaken himself, Rabbi says, this is very important. Even though people owe the zaken covered, the zaken should go out of his way not to trigger it. In other words, because every single time people have to show him covered, it could be a shtickle inconvenience. So now it's fascinating. So there's an obligation upon everyone to give cover to the zaken, and there's an obligation on the zaken to what? To avoid, when possible, triggering the need for behavioral cover. Don't be a tircha on people, right? Don't go ahead and make your cover just another thing they have to do. It's so incredible. Amar Abai says, Naktinon di makif chaye. Any zaken, I will say for that matter, any person whom one is obligated to honor, and that person, the recipient of the honor, literally makif means, I will say, walks around, meaning he takes the long way around so as not to cause people to stand up for him. Chaye, he's blessed with life. He's blessed with life. In other words, if you're makbid on the covet of other people, and you're makbid not to inconvenience other people, thereby adding back moments to their life, the reward ultimately is Cheshbon Baruch Hu rewards you with more life. Abaye makif. Abaye used to walk around so as to avoid causing people to stand up for him. Rabbi Zera makif. Rabbi Zera also did the same. Ravina Havi Yosef Kamed Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Difti. Ravina was sitting in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah from Difti. Chalafu Gavra Kamei V'lo Michsi Reishei. There was a guy who walked before Rabbi Yirmiyah without a head covering. Amar Kama Chatzif Ha Gavra. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said, what a chutzpah. The guy walks in front of me without a head covering. What a chutzpah that is. Amar Le Dilma Masa Mechasi Nihu Digisi Beirabanan. So ultimately, you're going to both say, so Ravina said to Rabbi Yirmiyah, maybe this guy's from Masa Mechasya. Masa Mechasya had a lot of Talmidei Chachamim. So Talmidei Chachamim were like the regular folk. So maybe this guy's from Masa Mechasya. He's used to being around Talmidei Chachamim, and therefore maybe he just doesn't behave in a regular bakavadik way in front of Talmidei Chachamim, not because he's not giving them covered, but because where he comes from, there's so many. I'll say, I'll give you the raya. You know, you can tell the difference between an in-town Jewish community and out-of-town Jewish community. So you know how? Do people say good Shabbos to each other, right? So I had this conversation with someone. I was for Shabbos somewhere, and I was walking with someone, and no one said good Shabbos. And this person said, so rude. I said, first of all, Plony, who may or may not be related to me, I said, Plony, don't talk about Jews that way. Don't call Jews rude. Don't call Jews anything. Jews are b'nei malachim. Jews are beautiful. Jews are fantastic. Jews are magnificent. They're not rude. When you live in a place where there are Jews everywhere, right? So the truth is, there's a certain level of just regularity and just, I'm trying to think of the right word, just regularity that comes. So like, it's not chas v'shalom ignoring. It's just, when you're at out of town community and like you see a Jew, you're like, Jew, right over here. You're all excited. The person is your best friend. It's like you go away, like you think you're going on vacation somewhere. You're the only Jew, right? And then you go, you find someone. It's like this is like your bashert. Like you're like we were together at Har Sinai. You love each other. You would never give this person the time of day if you met them back home. That's what happens. People just get accustomed to their surroundings. So often, if you live in a place where there's a lot of Jews, so that's what you get used to. And sometimes the greeting is not as forthcoming. Of course, we should greet everyone all the time. Okay, let's go weiter. So the Gemara says as follows: Isi ben Yehuda Omer, b'nei seva takom, afilu kol seva mashma. So what Isi ben Yehuda says, every seva, every person, either who's old and wise or even young and wise. I'm Rabbi Yochanan, Allah Isi ben Yehuda. Allah is like Isi ben Yehuda. We also said this before. Rabbi Yochanan havakai mikamei sabi darmayin. I will say here they're actually talking about all old people. All old people means you have to give cover to all old people, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish. All old people. These are all within Dalet Amos. All within Dalet Amos. So the Gemara says as follows: Rabbi Yochanan v'kay mikame sabi darmai. Rabbi Yochanan used to stand up for Aramean old people. Aramean old people, so Gentile old people. Amar kama harpaski adu alayu dahani. How much life experience do these people have? I will say it's incredible. Incredible with the respect that you have to treat the elderly. Rava mekam lokai hidra avalu. Rava wouldn't stand up. But instead, when an old person, Jewish or non-Jewish, came his way, he would move a little bit, right? I don't know what the right word for the scooch. I don't think it's scooch. That's not art scroll, right? It's not scooch. Whatever. You'd move. You move a little bit. So the Gemara says, Rava mekam lokayvar. Abaye yoiv yadal sabi. Abaye used to always extend his hand so that an old person could always support himself on them. Rava mishada shluche. Rava ultimately, again, because of his communal position, wouldn't help himself, but ultimately, again, would send his emissary. Rav Nachman mishada gozoi. Rav Nachman, again, who was related to the Reish Galusa. He was the chassan of the Nasi and the Av Beis Din. Ultimately, again, would also send his officers. Good. Amar ilav Torah kama Nachman bar Abba ika b'shuka. I can't help any stam old person because that would be a lack of kavod to the kavod Torah that I represent. But at the end of the day, he would still send his officers. We'll say incredible Gemara just in general about the kavod we have to give to the elderly. Sometimes in a society which only values people for their productivity, and productivity is defined by how much money you could generate. So sometimes the elderly are so often just disregarded and marginalized. But yet again, you see an older person and will say, how much life, again, look how does Chash Baruch Hu look at an old person? You're a zaken. You're a zeshikana chachma. Maybe you never opened the sefer in your life. Maybe not, but you lived life. And we all know you learn so much about yourself, about the world, and about life by living life. All of these great rabbanim giving cover to all of these Jewish and non-Jewish elderly people. Let's say Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis. Look at that. Ein Talmid Chacham. Okay, stop it. Right, I got it. Ein Talmid Chacham Rashi Lama Meirabo El Shachris Za'arvis. A Talmid Chacham is only permitted to get up for his Rebbe twice a day. Once stand up. Stand up for his Rebbe twice a day. Once in the morning, once in the evening. Why? Because I will say, since we get up twice for HaKadosh Baruch Hu a day, in other words, once for Shemona Esrei in the morning, and then it's linking Mincha Ma'ariv together in the evening. So you get up for HaKadosh Baruch Hu twice a day. You shouldn't get up for your Rebbe any more than you get up for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Is that true? Meisvei. How do we know that a zaken? What did we just say before? A zaken should not cause people to stand up for him, right? He shouldn't be matriach people. Talmud Lomar zaken v'yaresa. So now watch this. The amrit shachris va'arvis bilvat amaylo nitrach. So I don't understand if at the end of the day, there's only is an obligation to stand up for your Rebbe in the morning and the evening, so then why does the Rebbe have to diminish? Why does he have to avoid the tircha? They're obligated to stand up for him anyway, at least twice a day. Okay, so maybe more than twice a day you shouldn't be matriach, but twice a day you can be matriach. Ela lav kuliyoma. Rather, I will say it must be that alocha l'maisa, you have to stand up for your Rebbe at all times. At all times, right? No matter how many times during the day you have to stand up, you have to stand up. To which the Gemara says, "Lo, the olam shachris va'arvis bilvad." Really? You should only stand up for your Rebbe twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. Va'afilu hachi kama de'af sharlei lo nitrach. The Rebbe is interesting. The Gemara is now marrying these concepts. Even if you accept the premise that a Talmid Chacham shouldn't stand up for his Rebbe more than twice a day, so as not to catapult the kavod he gives to his Rebbe above the kavod he gives to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Even with that, so that would presuppose that there's an obligation to stand up for your Rebbe twice a day. The Rebbe himself should still avoid triggering that obligation. I will say it's such an incredible thing. People might owe you kavod, but don't collect. Don't collect. In other words, avoid triggering the obligation. So the Gemara says, I will say, and by the way, why does the Talmid Chacham, why does the Zaken have to, why does the Rebbe have to avoid triggering the obligation? I will say it's very simple. It's called humility, right? Again, I will say we're all people, and when people give you kavod and people give you sustained kavod, it's hard for these kind of things not to go to your head. Chazal wanted the Talmid Chacham, wanted everyone to remain humble. So it tells the Talmid Chacham, okay, people are obligated to stand up for you. That's great. You don't have to trigger the obligation. You don't have to trigger it. Let's go right. Remember, Lazar, call Talmid Chacham shein omei rabo nikra rasha. Any Talmid Chacham who doesn't stand up for his own Rebbe. So you're talking about a guy who himself is a Talmid Chacham, but he has a Rebbe. So any Talmid Chacham who doesn't stand up for his Rebbe is called the Rasha. Ve'eno ma'arich yamim. He does not enjoy longevity. V'talmudu mishtachach, and he forgets his learning. Shene emar v'tov lo yeh l'rasha v'lo yarich yom kesel asher eneni yorei melefnei Elokim. Mora zu ini yodei amau. I don't know what this mora is. Kishu omer v'yareisim elokecha harei mora zu kimo. So the mora, the reverence we're talking about over here, ultimately again is the reverence expressed by standing up. Maybe he's talking about the fear associated by not charging interest or by having proper weights. Rabbi Lazar, penei, or panai, gamar. He makes Xer Shabbos. Rabbi said this is incredible Gemara. So a Talmud Chacham still has to make sure to go ahead and honor his Rebbe. And if he doesn't, again, he loses, right? He could die prematurely. He forgets his learning. Again, it's a very simple cheshbon. If a Talmud Chacham forgets to respect his Rebbe, it means that his learning has gone to his head. And I don't mean in a good way. It means his learning has created an inflated ego, an inflated sense of self, and he has forgotten ultimately, again, the people who got him here. Such a person is not a Talmud Chacham, and therefore the Torah is removed from him. Incredibly. But some interesting cases here. Beno v'hu rabo ma'olam ve'abiv. Listen to this. What happens if the son is the Rebbe of his father? So you could have a father who maybe didn't have an education. Baruch Hashem, he gave his son an education. Now the son becomes the father's Rebbe. So I'll say, so what's the shaila? So ma'u lamo mibnei aviv. Ultimately, again, is the son obligated to stand up for his father? So in this case, again, the son is the son, but he's also the Rebbe. So is the son obligated to stand up for his good kasha? So Tashma, Aviv. So Tashma, Damar Shmuel Rabbi Yehuda. So Shmuel said to Rabbi Yehuda, we actually quoted this Gemara in yesterday's, I got confused, in yesterday's daf, which was this morning. Okay, right? So he quoted this morning, right? We said this was a sugya about how you're not supposed to tell your father that he's wrong. Right? If your father says something wrong, you shouldn't say you're wrong, but rather, again, a son should say, Father, there's a pasuk in the Torah that says like this. Right? So the Gemara says as follows. So Shmuel said, Rabbi Yehuda, Shinina, kum mekamei avucha. Shmuel said to Rabbi Yehuda, sharp one, stand up before your father. So Rabbi Yehuda's father was Rabbi Cheskel. Rabbi Yehuda, listen to this, the son, Rabbi Yehuda, was his father's Rebbe. He taught his father the majority of Torah. And yet you see Shmuel is telling Rabbi Yehuda, stand up for your father. So you see from here what? That even if the son is the Rebbe to his father, the son is still obligated to give cover to his father. So the Gemara says, Shani Rabbi Cheskel the Baal Maisim Hava. Rabbi Cheskel was different. His father was different, because he was a Baal Maisim. He might have not been a Talmud Chacham, I will say, but he was a man who engaged in great deeds. And everyone saw him as a Baal Maisim. I will say, isn't that incredible? That sometimes what makes people great is not simply the amount of Torah they learn, but again, it's their meisim, it's their actions. So here you have this Rabbi Cheskel, who might not have been a Talmud Chacham, but Lamaisi, he was what the Gemara calls a Baal Maisim. We'll say, isn't that an aspirational statement? Who amongst us, can you imagine if after 120, someone stands up by our Levaya and they say, this guy, he was a Baal Maisim. He was an actional Yid. He did things. He accomplished things. He didn't just talk, he did. What a shvach, what a compliment, what an accomplishment. So the Gemara goes like that. Shmuel also used to stand in front of Rabbi Cheskel. Ella mai kamerle. So then what was Shmuel saying to Rabbi Yehuda? So I will say what Shmuel was saying to Rabbi Yehuda was as follows. Sometimes you're going to be with me, and maybe your father is going to walk by. Even if your father walks by when you are with me, halacha l'maisa, make sure to go ahead and still stand up for your father. In other words, I will say, what is that referring to? We're going to see there's another halacha. The halacha is that when you're in the presence of your Rebbe, one is not supposed to give kavod to someone else. Because giving kavod to someone else in the presence of my Rebbe is a slight to the Rebbe. Shmuel was saying to Rabbi Yehuda, if you're with me and your father walks by, stand up. Stand up, give him kavod. Give him kavod. Good. Ibailuhu, beno, v'hu rabo ma'u, avim mipanav. Okay, well, here's the reverse question. Same case, the son is the father's Rebbe. The son is the father's Rebbe. So I will say, what's happening over here? Son is the father's Rebbe, and now the shaila is the father obligated to stand up for his son? So we just established that even if the son is the father's Rebbe, the son still has to stand up for his father. But does the father have to stand up for his son, who is also his Rebbe? So Tashma Dara Yeshua Levi, Ani Eini Kedai Lamo Mipnei Bini, Ela Mishum Kavod Beis Nasi. So Yeshua ben Levi said, I wouldn't normally have to stand up in front of my son, except that halacha l'maisa, he is part of the Nasi's household, and that's why I go ahead and stand up. Taima da'ana Rabbe. The reason is because I am my son's Rebbe. Ha'ihu Rabbe, but if he were my Rabbi, if he were my Rebbe, ka'imna kameh, I would have stand up before him. Hachikam is what it means to say. Ani eini kedai la'amod mipnei b'ni. We'll say first white line, right? Mipnei b'ni v'afilu hu Rabbi da'ha'ana avua. No, we'll say what he was saying was like this. I don't have to stand. Mr. Zwani, we're starting in just a few moments. Chasidus is good. You're in the right place. You're in the right place. So we'll say so. Good, you're in the right place. So let's say, so listen to this. What he was saying was as follows. I don't have to stand up for my son. You don't have to stand up for my son, Rabbi. You know why? Because I'm his father. Even if he's my Rebbe, I'm still his father. And as his father, I am not obligated. A father is never obligated to stand up for his son, even if the son is the Rebbe for his father. Incredible. The Gemara says, "Ela mishum kavod beis nasi." The only difference also over here is Rabbi Shmuel Silber said, my son married into the Nasi's family. So now my son represents the Nasi's family. As such, I stand up for him, not out of kavod for him, but ultimately, again, out of kavod for the Nasi. Said Rabbi, what we have over here is as follows. If you have a father-son relationship and the son is the Rebbe for the father, we'll say, by the way, well, how beautiful that must be, right? If a person is able to raise a son who's able to become his Rebbe, that's like the pinnacle of parental accomplishment. So, right, the son is the father's Rebbe. So, Allah Chalamaysa, again, son is still obligated to stand up for his father. Father is not obligated to stand up for his son. Incredible. So, we'll say, so now this is an interesting shaila. This is interesting. We'll say, imagine, so here's what we've established. The person has to stand up for the Rebbe. Right? We'll say, let's go through this. When do you have to stand up for your Rebbe? When do you have to stand up? When? Talad Amos, unless of course it's Rabbi Muvhak. If it's your primary Rebbe, then when? As soon as you see him. You see the ears of his donkey, you stand up, right? So we'll say, so let say again, so now what about the following situation? What happens if my Rebbe is riding by? You know, he's on a wagon, or contemporarily, he's in a car. So he passes by, am I obligated to stand up if he's not stationary? He's Rachov, so he's riding by. Is there an obligation of Kima to stand up if he's riding by? So Olo, Rabbi Abai says, Tashma, Tame Yosef Tachas Ha'ilan, Vitar Omeid. So we'll say again, this is the halach of tzaras. Somebody with tzaras has the ability to convey tumah through an ohel. But I will say there is a unique halach of tzaras which says like this: the only way that a mitzora could convey tumah to someone else, ultimately through an ohel, is how? Is if the mitzora is sitting. Xeris HaKasav, Rashi goes through the whole limud. Only if the mitzora is sitting does he convey tumah to someone else underneath the ohel. So watch this. So Yosef Tachas Ha'ilan. I'm sorry. So the Gemara says as follows: Tamei Yoshe Tachasi. So if the Metzora is sitting under a tree, Vitar Omeid, and the person whose tar is standing, Tamei, the person whose tar becomes Tamei. Because again, it doesn't matter if the tar guy is sitting or standing, as long as the Metzora is sitting, he conveys Tumas Ohel. Omeid Tachas Ha'ilan, right? But if the Metzora is standing underneath the tree, Vitar Yoshe, but the guy whose tar is sitting, tar, ultimately again, the guy who is tar remains tar. Vim Yashav Hatamei, Hatar Tamei. Once the Metzora sits down underneath, let's say the tree canopy or in the ohel, once he sits down, ultimately again, the tar person becomes tamei. V'chein be'even hamenugas. And ultimately, we'll say the same thing is what happens if you bring a stone that has saras on it. So a stone that has saras could also convey tumah through an ohel, but once again, only if the stone is at rest, right? So how is a stone at rest? That the person who's holding it is sitting down. So we'll say, so what do you see? Va'amar Rav Nachman bar Kohen, Zoso Maris, Rachov Kamalak. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that ultimately, again, something that is moving, ultimately, again, Rachov, something that is being transported, ultimately, again, is as if it's Mahalik. Because again, the idea over here is that if there's a guy holding a stone, but he's not sitting, that's as if it's moving. So we'll say, so you see from here, there's something that is moving, ultimately as a din of Mahalik. Therefore, Allah Lamaisa Shmamina. Therefore, we'll say, Zoso Maris, Rachov Kamalak. Therefore, we'll say, Allah Lamaisa. If your Rebbe passes by in a car or in a wagon, there would not be an obligation to stand up. The only obligation to stand up, ultimately, again, is when the Rebbe is quote-unquote stationary. Now, stationary doesn't have to mean he's standing still in the Daled Amos, but he's physically present. If he's just riding through, there is no obligation, ultimately, again, of kibud. Dibayluhu, mahu lamo me sefer Torah. But say, is there an obligation to stand up for a sefer Torah? Rabbi Chilkiah, Rabbi Simon, Rabbi Lazar, Amri Kavachomer, mipnei lomdeha omdim mipaneh lo kol shekain. But say, if you have to stand up for Talmidei Chachamim, then what? Of course, you have to stand up for a sefer Torah itself. Incredible. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Zavdi, Hava Yasvi. So we'll say Rabbi Yaakov Bar Zavdi were sitting. Chalif va'azar Rabbi Shimon Bar Abba. Rabbi Shimon Bar Abba passed by and they stood up. The Rabbanim stood up. Amar Lahu. So again, Rabbi Shimon said, "Don't stand up for me." Chada the asun chachimi va'ana chaver. First of all, you're greater Talmidei Chachamim than I am. You're Talmidei Chachamim, and I'm just a chaver. I will say there are different gradations of Talmidei Chachamim. So Talmid Chacham is the highest level. Under Talmid Chacham is a chaver. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Shimon said, "I'm only a chaver. You're Talmidei Chachamim." Furthermore, va'od klum Torah omedes mipnei lomdeha. Furthermore, again, I will say a Torah doesn't stand up before those who learn it. So this is actually very beautiful. What Rabbi Shmuel was saying is like this: when a person learns Torah, both say they become Torah. Isn't this beautiful? When you learn Torah, you're not just simply learning. When you learn Torah, you become Torah. Rabbi Shimon says, you guys are learning. Because you're learning, you're a Sefer Torah. I'm someone who learns Torah. The Torah doesn't stand up for those who learn it. Savarlak Rabbi Lazar, Damar Rabbi Lazar, Ein Talmud Chacham Rashay Lamo Mifnei Rabo, B'Shah Osek Batorah. Ultimately, again, so again, Rabbi Lazar said, a Talmud Chacham should not stand up before his Rebbe at a time that he's learning. When a Talmud Chacham is learning, right, when he's learning, he is Torah. So once he is Torah, he should not stand up before his Rebbe. Layet Allah Abaye. Abaye cursed this ruling. Abaye said that is not correct. A Talmud Chacham should always stand up for his Rebbe, even when he's learning. Rabbi say, what's the pshat over there? Because Abaye is of the opinion, Derech Eretz Kadma La Torah. Even if you are learning, and you become part of Torah, Derech Eretz Kadma La Torah. Proper interpersonal conduct, proper kavod, proper Derech Eretz takes precedence over everything. Rabbi say, we will stop here for today. That's far enough down. It was tremendous hashikach. It was such a schus baruch Hashem to be able to learn with all of you. Again, everyone is invited to stay for the Chassidish year, which is going to begin in Mirat Hashem in just a few moments. It was tremendous. Thank you for accommodating the schedule. Mirat Hashem, looking forward to learning with everyone tomorrow. So there's no shir tomorrow morning. Slichas begin at 6:10 a.m. 6:10 a.m. Shkoyach.